Yeah, I mean, the difficulty is you've got a leadership in power that's completely unpredictable. And if you look at how they offered to resolve the situation in Gaza, you know, this kind of cowboy idea of, Americans are going to take it over and build casinos there or something. How is this applied to the other major war in the world, in Ukraine? It doesn't augur very well that, you wouldn't expect Trump and Musk, who's obviously behind a lot of Trump's decision making, would agree that the fighting could only stop if Ukraine is given back all the territory that Russia has occupied. So, yeah, but the question is, what guarantees would Ukraine have in this case if you come to a negotiated peace that war won't break out again in 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, or whenever? Even if Putin's gone, there are people in that Security Council who are backing the war quite strongly. And it's very hard to see Russians in any kind of position of authority today in Russia who are opposed to this war. There are a few obvious voices that we've heard from Garry Kasparov and others, but they're people in exile. They're not people with any real count in Russia. So then logically, you've got to think, well, what can Ukraine retain and how can it retain them? And I think it has to have some guarantee. I mean, the Budapest Memorandum collapsed completely because nobody backed it up. Of course, the Russians didn't, but neither did the Americans or the British. And that was the only guarantee that the Ukrainians had of retaining all their territory for the loss of their nuclear weapons. Ukraine can build its own nuclear weapons, but how quickly can it build nuclear weapons realistically, particularly given the devastation that's been caused by the war? If it gives up territory, what territory would it agree to give up? And I would say that you would have to differentiate territory that you cannot possibly get back and territory that is really yours. There's been no negotiation, for example, on Kherson or Zaporizhia. This is clearly territory that belongs in Ukraine, but the vast majority population there wants to be in Ukraine. Crimea and, let's say, Donetsk, Luhansk, a little bit more iffy. Those regions have not been controlled by Ukraine for a decade now. So even if, let's say, the whole of Donetsk and Luhansk regions back in 1991, back even in 2013, if you'd had a referendum there, they would have voted to stay with Ukraine. Now, it's unlikely because there's so much population moved in there. There's military regimes, ethnic Russians moving in as well. You would not, even in a free vote, even in a Kuzio-style referendum, you would not get a vote in Ukraine's favor in those two regions, nor would you in Crimea either. So if you lost those regions, do you still have a viable state? If Ukraine could keep Kherson, keep Zaporizhia, would it still be viable as a state in the center of Europe? The answer is probably it would, but it would have to be guaranteed either by NATO, not even NATO membership, but guaranteed by NATO, or some kind of UN force that would stay in the border for the next 10 years and make sure that there were no changes there. It can't be something like the OSCE because it's not strong enough. A UN mandated force, which would include, for example, Americans or Chinese or Indians, wherever. It could obviously be an amalgam of different ethnic groups from UN, would be the only guarantee. And I've thought about this a lot, I mean, that you come to a stage where you don't want to give up anything. That's the position, right? You cannot give up a single foot of land to the occupants. But the second question is, how are you going to get it back? How do you propose to get this land back? Who is going to support it? And unfortunately, you don't have the United States behind you, which is really the only power that could do it, at least for the next 4 years.